Farmers are tough and resilient, but that doesn't mean they have to go it alone. When the stressors of farm life get to be too much, everyone needs someone to talk to. The Farm Family Wellness Alliance provides access to free, anonymous mental health and well-being services. Access starts at TogetherAll and is available to any farmer in the United States and their family members aged 16 or older. Learn more and get your free account set up today.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us today for our Farm Foundation Forum, Unwrapping Packaging Regulations Impacting Agricultural Trade and Sustainability. We are glad to have the opportunity to engage with you, and we're thankful to Farm Credit for their support of this forum. My name is Martha King, and I am the Vice President of Programs and Projects at Farm Foundation, located just outside of Chicago, Illinois. I'm looking forward to today's discussion, which will take a look at packaging rules and regulations impacting growers and agriculture companies with a specific look at packaging in the fruit and vegetable supply chains. Before we get into today's program, I'm going to take just a few moments to share a bit more about Farm Foundation. We are a 501c3 nonprofit working at the intersection of agriculture and society to address challenges that affect the entire food and ag value chain. Specifically, we are an accelerator of practical solutions for agriculture, accelerating people and ideas into action. The three levers we use to accomplish this are policy, innovation, and education. Forums such as today's are just one part of our extensive program of work, which is guided by our mission to build trust and understanding at the intersection of agriculture and society, and our vision to build a future for farmers, our communities, and our world. We rely on partnerships to fund our work and increase our impact, so if you're interested in learning more about funding or partnering with us, I invite you to reach out to explore collaboration. Now, I'd like to take a minute to highlight our Friends of Farm Foundation program. With your enrollment as a friend, you will not only be helping to support the mission and vision of Farm Foundation, but you will also gain exclusive benefits such as first reads of our issue reports, networking opportunities, and much more. Being a friend is an investment in building a better future for farmers, our communities, and our world. To learn more about being a friend of Farm Foundation, go to farmfoundation.org/friends. The link is also being posted in the chat. In addition to learning more about Farm Foundation and our work by visiting our website, I encourage you to connect with us on our social media platforms. If you are posting on social media about this afternoon's session, we ask you to please use #FarmFoundationForum. And now a final few housekeeping notes. There will be an audience Q&A session at the end. We will be using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and not the chat to queue questions, so please post those questions there. This forum is being recorded and will be posted on our website at farmfoundation.org, as well as on our YouTube channel. We'll send out that link following today's program. When the forum concludes, you will receive a link to a brief survey. We appreciate your feedback and your time in completing the survey. Now let's turn to today's forum topic, packaging regulations. As countries and companies look to limit their packaging footprint, today's outstanding panel of industry leaders will explore how proposed regulations might not only impact supply chains and global food and ag trade, but also how they impact producers. It's my pleasure to introduce as our moderator and discussion leader, Cory Connors. Cory is the Director of Sustainable Packaging at Orora Packaging Solutions and has been working in the packaging industry for 2.5 decades, starting out working in a Weyerhaeuser corrugated production facility in college. He has ever since been focused on sustainable packaging and helping companies be more sustainable with their packaging. He is also a sustainable packaging influencer, hosting the Sustainable Packaging Podcast, which has 73,000 downloads, and he's author of the Sustainable Packaging newsletter on LinkedIn that goes out to 11,000 subscribers, to say nothing of his following on TikTok. We are so pleased to have you as our moderator today, Cory. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Martha. It's a true honor to be here, and I really appreciate this opportunity to speak with many people in this industry and in farming and in packaging community about how we can improve the sustainability of our packaging while still staying in compliance with all of these new EPR laws that are coming and all of these new agreements, both national and international. So it's very exciting. Please go to the next slide, Katie. So as a packaging professional, I've worked at Orora Packaging Solutions for about 22 years. It's an amazing company. We're a global packaging company based out of Melbourne, Australia, about a $5 billion company. With the recent acquisition of Saver Glass, we've doubled down on our glass production And with that partnership, I think that puts us over $7 billion in sales. Very exciting to be a part of this company. We make corrugated packaging and have 55 locations in North America to service all kinds of packaging materials. We are material agnostic, and as we'll get into during this event, we need to remember that packaging materials all have their place and all have the right time to be used in the right situation. So oftentimes people will ask me, what's the most sustainable material? And the answer is that depends. And that's why Orora is such a great partner, because we're a packaging solutions provider. Be sure to check out our new Sustainable Design Lab in San Jose, California. It's an amazing place to try out new things and innovate with us. To the next slide, please. So a long, long time ago, I was 18-year-old and graduated from high school and wasn't ready for college. So I went and worked at Weyerhaeuser. I spent 5 years making boxes, which is where I got my nickname, Corrugated. A very hilarious combination of my first name and corrugated, as you know. And about 3 years ago, when COVID hit, I decided I'm going to tell everybody everything that I know about packaging. And that turned into me being an influencer in the industry. And I can't believe how much it's taken off. I'm honored and humbled by this opportunity to be a conduit of information for the all of the packaging professionals. So if you have an innovative packaging material, reach out to me. As my main job is to find new materials and to innovate in the world of sustainable packaging. I truly love this industry, and I'm very excited about what's happening in sustainable packaging and in packaging in general. It's the innovations coming are incredible. You'll see a lot of new things, and if you don't think this involves you, it does. Anybody who eats food, anybody who buys anything will be affected by all of these great changes that we're making and these positive differences that are happening in the world of sustainable packaging. So I'm very excited to introduce our first guest. Tamara is well, she's a very impressive person in the world of packaging, and she is the Vice President of Sustainability at the International Fresh Produce Association. She has over 2 decades of experience in sustainability for agriculture and forestry. Previously, she served as the Executive Director of Great Mountain Forest, where she worked to promote conservation and sustainable forestry, and was also responsible for the organization's carbon investment program. Prior to that role, she served as the Senior Global Manager in Sustainability and R&D at Driscoll's, where she focused on a variety of organizational strategies that included sustainable packaging and plastic use, communications to promote the company's sustainability efforts, and provided strategic guidance for the research and development department and relevant work teams. Thank you for joining us, Tamara.
Hello, good morning. Thank you so much for having me in this webinar. Thank you, Cory, for the introduction, and thank you to the Farm Foundation for this opportunity to talk about one of the most complex topics in the area of sustainability, and particularly for the produce industry, which I represent. So I work for the International Fresh Produce Association. Next slide, please. Our association represents the entire supply chain of the produce and floral industries globally. Next slide, please. Our companies expand around the globe. And I wanted to tell you about what we do so we can frame the conversation clearly. My area is sustainability. And in sustainability, we work in regenerative agriculture and water and food waste, etc., but very, very much in packaging. And we support our companies in their packaging sustainability journey. Next slide, please. Could you, yes, next. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. So this morning, I just want to make sure that we all understand what produce means and what packaging means in produce. So consumption of fruits and vegetables has very important benefits for human health. I think we're all clear that these are very important foods in our lives, but also because we're talking about sustainability. Something that is important is that increasing our consumption of fruits and vegetables lowers our carbon footprint and our environmental footprint overall. So that is a good start to our sustainability journey. Also, because packaging is a very big part of our industry, what we are doing, what we're working on, all of our companies are to, us particularly as an association, is to establish goals and best practices for sustainable packaging. To say produce and not say packaging, it's impossible. The other day, there was an article in the New York Times that, with a great analogy, it is as if we're selling melting ice. That is how our industry works. We have a very complex supply chain to bring these fresh products from the point of production in the farms to the consumer, and that could take days on a truck, on an airplane, on a boat, etc. And that has to go through a very complex supply chain that has to arrive in perfect condition, because quality is important for all of us, but food safety is the most important. It has to be safe for consumption, and we all want to avoid food waste. That is a big goal for all of us, right? In order to do that, we need packaging, and that's where we are. Next slide, please. However, consumers these days, and the data shows that consumers are very, very interested in packaging and in the environmental footprint of packaging for many reasons. Most of us see the plastic patches in the ocean. We care about waste in general. We care about our health, about pollution and resources. But packaging is in the minds of consumers. Consumers are all of us, right? We are citizens. And the result of this really big concern on packaging is, next slide, that regulations around the world are transforming strongly and rapidly to address those concerns from citizens and consumers, just the public in general. But what we're finding ourselves right now in our industry is a disconnection between what we need to succeed in terms of bringing those products to market and the new regulations that are making it difficult right now for us to keep that supply chain in the timelines that we have for sustainable packaging. And I'll explain more into detail. The regulations around the world, they're not that different from one another. They're just going at different speeds. And in general, they share a common goal, and that is to reduce or end single-use plastic. And we would say that today, or until maybe a few months ago, the EU was the region in the world where the regulations were most strict around single-use plastic. But then came Canada, and Canada came with the strongest regulations on single-use plastic, and then now Australia, New Zealand, etc. To give you an example from the EU and Canada, by 2028 or 2030, there will be elimination of plastic for produce products. That might seem simple for some, but because our biggest goal is to maintain food safety, quality, and reduce food waste, that could be impossible for us right now. The technology might not be there right now. Our supply chain might not be organized yet in a way that all of that can happen in that timeline. And so regulations are right now very much complicating our work instead of supporting our work, because we were in a path for sustainable packaging. And so that what we want to do is to work with regulators and with governments and the civil society organizations to make sure that those regulations achieve our environmental sustainability goals, but also maintain food safety, quality, and reduce food waste. And for that, we created the Alliance for Sustainable Packaging Foods with other organizations like ours, just to have one voice. And because in this area, the best we can do is to collaborate. Next slide, please. But many of you are probably thinking, okay, let's talk about specific packaging and what's happening in produce packaging and materials. So I'll give you a little bit of an explanation on where we are in that journey. And there will be others in our webinar that will go more in detail on that sustainable packaging journey. So again, what is our goal? Is to reduce, is to maintain food safety, quality, and reducing waste, and while having sustainable packaging. So the first material we can think of is, of course, plastic, right? This is where we are right now in our history, is that the material that performs the best to do all the things that I told you before, to go through that complex supply chain, is plastic. But plastic has important environmental footprints. It's very much regulated against. And so we want to improve the environmental footprint of plastic. And how is that done? Mostly through two variables. One is to make it more recyclable. And the second is to increase its recycled content. So using plastic that is already been recycled. So there's a circular economy component added to the plastic packaging. The next topic is recycling, as I mentioned, not only for plastic, but for any material that we use for fresh produce packaging. Improving recyclability, it's extremely complex because most of the time is out of our hands. It's in the hands of municipalities around the world that have very different ways of sorting the materials or transforming the materials, right? The recycling part of the process. And we could do all our best and choose the best materials, but if at the end there isn't a system to separate them and to really transform it, all those efforts are wasted. And that is very complex. And we need governments to help us in that process. So it's all a continuous system for sustainable performance. And the next topic is compostables, not only for packaging, but also for PLU stickers. PLU stickers in our world are very important. Are those little stickers that you see in some of the bigger fruits. They're not packaging per se, but they can be used as packaging because they contain all the information necessary for that product to be sold. And therefore, they're the smallest packaging possible, and therefore they're very sustainable. On the compostable front, everyone is excited about compostable materials. Our companies are working really hard there, but the innovation is not exactly quite there yet. In some stances, yes, but not for all materials. However, this is where the regulations are getting a little bit complex. In many countries, including Canada and the EU, we're seeing bannings on compostable materials, not because they're not good for the environment. They're great for the environment, but they need very specific systems at the end. They need digesters, and they need systems that transform them, right, and make them into compost. If that doesn't exist, they can pollute and contaminate the waste in general, or the recycling stream. So that makes it very complex. And the last but not least is to think outside the box, and to think about redesigning the system and reusable packaging. Reusable packaging is the most complex type of packaging for the produce industry, not only because of food waste and food loss and food safety, but also because of the complexity of our supply chain. If one material starts in one place and ends in another, how is the reverse supply chain for it? That reverse supply chain might have a bigger footprint. And so, but we're still looking at that. We're still looking at efficiencies in finding reusable packaging. There are some examples in the produce industry, like trays or some of the bags that you can use in the grocery store. And that is pretty much our landscape for what we're working on in sustainable packaging. All of our companies, from the growers, the packers, the packaging companies, the retailers, I can tell you for sure that their mind is in the future, is in creating the most sustainable packaging possible. And right now, what we need to succeed is the support from innovators, the support from governments as we go in this transition, as we are succeeding in this transition. And right now, with some regulations, we need just more time to get there. I just want to thank you all for listening to me, because we have a great roast of panelists. And yes, thank you so much. And I'll answer some of your questions if you have some of them right now or at the end.
Thank you so much, Tamara. That was really, really great. Very well done. I am so excited to see over 100 people listening and watching and contributing at this time. And I think I'd like to request that anybody listening, tell us where you're listening from. I'm amazed. I've seen people from Europe and people from all over the US already. And be sure to put some questions in the Q&A section, and we're going to answer questions after each panelist speaks. And then at the end, we're going to have about 20 minutes to answer more questions. So if we don't get to yours right away, be sure to keep those questions coming. There aren't any questions in the Q&A yet, but I've got a couple here. Tamara, I would love to know your thoughts on reusable packaging, if it could be used in a way that would encourage people to save money, meaning if you could give a credit for a reusable pack being brought back. Is that something that you've looked into or you have thoughts on? Oh, you're on mute, my friend.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, we're looking at all options possible. Right now, I'll give you two examples where successful reusable packaging exists in our industry. And
Right.
one of them is, without getting into much detail, I spoke mostly on primary packaging. In our industry, we have secondary packaging and we have tertiary packaging, just to further complicate things. So if you think of clamshells, those are primary packaging. Secondary packaging are trays, where those clamshells are brought into from one place to another. So those trays sometimes they could be primary packaging for some products. And so those trays are easily reusable. There are several companies that do reuse them. Then they have a great supply chain that waits for them at the end of their when they're being consumed at the retailer and brought back as part of their supply chain. You need global companies in order to do that. And you need companies with a very sophisticated supply chain in order to do that. Other than that, there's also bags that one can use for when you go in the supermarket, put your produce, and then you wash them at home. That's another example. But reusable packaging poses one big conundrum, and that is food waste, because it has to be packaging needs to be cleaned up in a way that eliminates all pathogens. And also the packaging ends at the retailer, and so the retailer has to send that packaging somewhere. Sometimes the grower is thousands of miles away, so the source of that packaging is thousands of miles away. So that's bringing that packaging back might not be very sustainable, even though it sounds like a fantastic idea. In the end, it might not be. And I come back to that what you said before, which was brilliant, and this is what I say all the time. It depends so much in sustainability. It depends, right? It's very, very complex. Sometimes we think we're doing the right thing, and sometimes it's not as easy as it seems.
Very well said. Thank you so much. This has been great. We do have a really insightful question here. I think I'm going to ask you this question and then possibly pose it to the group after. But how do regulations around sustainable packaging positively and or negatively impact goals around reducing food waste along the supply chain?
So interestingly enough, regulations around the world on packaging, they rarely take into consideration food waste. In fact, is it us, the industry, when we talk to regulators, that we have to tell them, wait a minute, your regulations or the regulations you're trying to put forward might have an impact on food waste. There's a huge disconnect, and it's not, I'm not picking on regulators, it's just in general society, a huge disconnect from what we think we know to the reality. For us, in order to reduce food waste, this is crazy, you need more packaging. That's where we are right now. And so most of the regulations have nothing to do with food waste. They rarely take that into consideration. And all of our considerations as an industry are to eliminate food waste, not only because we want to be more responsible, but also we want to be, more profitable. We want to use our products to the maximum, right? We want to use all of our products and sell all of our products and have the consumer eat all of their products. So no, food waste is very much a second thought right now for most people.
It can be very counterintuitive, right?
Yes,
and
very
it's very
counterintuitive.
Frustrating. But there's nothing sustainable about rotten food, and we need to work together to eliminate that as much as possible. Well said. Thank you so much, Tamara. This is very insightful. Appreciate your wisdom. And we'll move on to the next speaker. We're going to hear from Mr. Jeffrey Brandenburg. He is the Sustainable Packaging Design and Technology, Post-Harvest Technology, Packaging and Food Processing Equipment, and Food Safety for the fresh food industry, with over 45 years of experience in the packaging technology. He serves on the Sustainability Council and Sustainable Packaging Working Group of the International Fresh Produce Association. Jeff is a lecturer at Chapman University teaching the food packaging course, which is part of the Master in Food Science program. He is a lecturer at UC Davis in the Food Science Department, as well as the Post-Harvest Technology Center. Thank you for joining us, Jeff.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Cory. It's an exciting topic. It's a fascinating topic. And yeah, let's get right into it. Next slide, please. So QFresh Lab, which I am the founder of, we are a consulting company and independent quality testing laboratory specializing in shelf life, food quality, food safety, post-harvest physiology, and sustainable packaging. So we kind of work at that intersection where quality, safety, sustainable packaging all come together. Next slide. So what I'm going to be talking about today, Tamara did a great job. There are going to be others that are going to talk specifically about the regulations and the myriad of regulations. And certainly companies like ours work with our clients to help them walk through that myriad of regulations. But more importantly, I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about the packaging itself. And so independent of packaging type, whether you're talking about conventional polymers, biopolymers, compostable, fiber, post-consumer recycle, we really have to start with what is it that we want the packaging to do? Because if we're talking about a standard polymer package and we want to replace that with something else, before we can think about replacing it, we have to understand its functionality. What are we asking that package to do? Is it physical protection? Is it just sales, marketing, information, regulations? Are we keeping what's in and keeping what's out? Is it visibility? Combined with physical protection. So we really need to understand how this package works and what its role is before we can make any changes to it. And that's where one of the things in some of the regulations that are being proposed, and we're working both in Europe and Canada and North and South America working with these regulations. One of the areas that's been missed to a certain extent, although I must say people are becoming more and more aware, is this concept of functionality. And whether you're talking about fresh produce, whether you're talking about frozen foods, whether you're talking about packaging that's used on the farm level, meat, cheese, whatever, each package is designed around a certain parameters of functionality. And fresh produce is even more unique than a lot of traditional food packaging found in retail or food service. Next slide, please. So as we talked about physical protection, crush strength, this is one of the challenges that sometimes comes up with fiberboard packaging, although they can be solved. And please understand, ladies and gentlemen, our company does not promote one type of packaging over another. We work with all of them. Our goal is to help our clients and help governments and industry just understand the advantages and disadvantages, because Tamara was absolutely right. And we get asked all the time, what's the ideal package? It does not exist. It depends. It depends on the distribution channel, what you're asking the package to do, what kind of produce or food product are you packaging in it, what's the environment that the package, is it heated, is it cooled, is it chilled, is it frozen, is it wet? Is it going to be going into pusher racks like tray salads do? Because those pusher racks compress that packaging a lot. So the crush strength of the packaging becomes very important. Whereas if it's just being displayed out on a kiosk or in a refrigerated section, crusher strength isn't as important. So it depends on what you want that packaging to do. Visibility is another thing, especially in the fresh produce arena. People want to see whether their produce is fresh. They want to look at it. That becomes a challenge for fiber-based products, is the visibility. So are there workarounds? Yes, there are workarounds. Are they ideal? Depends on the situation. But I cannot stress enough, you cannot find a sustainable alternative, whatever that may mean, to your package until you understand what the package can do. And this is a bit of a perception issue as well, because, and we'll talk about it in another slide, 90% of the package's job in most cases is done before the consumer sees it, before they actually touch it, feel it, or use it. So all they see is something that has to be discarded or recycled. They don't necessarily have a concept of everything that package did to get it from the field to the consumer's home. And then when you talk about fresh produce, because we have the honor and privilege in the fresh produce industry of packaging something that's alive. It consumes oxygen, it gives off carbon dioxide. So not only does the packaging have to be able to protect it, absorb moisture, have crush strength, it actually has this symbiotic relationship between the produce item and the package. So there's functionality with gas transmission rates going on that has to be designed into the package and taken into account. Next slide. So there are all different kinds of ways to achieve sustainability, source reduction. We get a lot of calls. Well, can I reduce the size of the package? Can I get away with a thinner material? So the Flexible Packaging Association coined the term less waste in the first place. There's compostable. It's industrial, home compostable. One of the challenges, one of the technical hurdles with compostable films is what is the trigger that initiates compostability? In some cases, it's heat. Some cases, it's moisture. There are other triggers. So what's fascinating with compostable materials is, and there are some very good ones out there, when do you have it start to compost? You don't want it compost until the consumer's done using it. And then you want it to compost as rapidly as possible under whatever conditions. And not only do you want it to compost step one, which is taking a big polymer and breaking it down to little pieces of polymer, then you have to have step two, which is actually the mineralization part, which actually goes back into the earth and not just little small pieces of plastic. So how do you turn that trigger? How do you make sure that it composts when we want it to start composting and not before? You'll hear a lot about post-recycled content. Tamara mentioned it. Kevin's going to mention it in detail coming up. Again, great. There's a lot of promise in that area, a lot of ways to include post-consumer recycled content into packaging. But availability is a challenge because we aren't recycling enough. And then, of course, there's the biopolymers and fiberboard, cellulose, bamboo, sugarcane, all very exciting, all have advantages and disadvantages. So there is not a carte blanche, just do this and your problems are solved. Next slide, please. So, in summary, suffice it to say that a single packaging choice can have many ecological repercussions, and sometimes they can be contradictory. So what's good for this application is not necessarily good for another application. And this is where companies like my company and others and the IFPA and Western Growers and CPMA and USDA are all looking at how can we create the best optimal package for each application. So what is the most sustainable solution for one product or particular market might not be the same elsewhere. But whatever your solution, it's got to be consistent and you've got to be able to back it up with science. I've worked in sustainable packaging for almost 30 years now, and it's just been recently that it's actually science-based. It actually was a long time ago, much more of a marketing ploy, and there were a lot of stretches to the science. Now consumers are much more educated and they're coming back to people like me and the growers, the packers, the shippers, the packaging companies and saying, okay, you say this is sustainable. Tell me how and why and how it works. So from my perspective, that's very refreshing because I work in science and sustainable packaging, especially with some of the new rules and regulations, has to be based in science. We have to move that science forward. Again, just repeating quickly, by the time the consumer uses the package, 90% of its job has already been done. And I think Tamara mentioned this and others and Cory, a lot of additional research is required. We don't have all the answers right now. We have more answers than we did a year ago, and we'll have a lot more answers in another few years, but it's an evolutionary process. Next slide. So I can't talk enough about making sure it's optimally designed. Make sure that whatever you choose, however you plan to move your sustainable packaging forward, it's optimally designed. You take into account all of the fundamentals and everything that needs to be covered so that package can continue to do the job that it was originally designed for. So at the end of the day, what are the customer requirements and what creative technologies can be brought to bear? And we supply a support service. The packaging industry shouldn't be just about here's the price for your package. We need to step up, and we are stepping up, making sure that sustainable packaging does what it needs to do. And again, this is a global effort. We work globally, IFPA works globally, looking and working with countries and states and communities and areas to make sure that we can move sustainable packaging forward and actually have it do its job. And I think that's the last slide. One more, maybe? Yeah, that's it. So thank you again, everyone. Cory, thanks for having me, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you so much, Jeff. This was really insightful and appreciate your wisdom there. I'm excited. There's another question here from Stephanie Clark in the audience. And she says, as a consumer, I try my best to avoid packaging that's not recyclable. I speak up on the packing when our company creates a new product. Is there anything else I can do as a consumer to be more sustainable?
Well, certainly, yeah, if you buy packaging, and this is one of the challenges, there are packages that can be recycled that are not currently being recycled. So again, talking to your community, talking to your county, your state, single polymer packages. A lot of work we do is taking packages from multiple polymer packaging to a single polymer packaging. But so single polymer packaging is easier to recycle than multiple polymer packaging, but there's also a geometry involved. So trays are much easier recycled right now than flexible packaging. Doesn't
Right.
mean flexible packaging can't be recycled, especially if it's single polymer. But the infrastructure, as Tamara indicated in the previous talk, the infrastructure doesn't necessarily exist. And some of the recycling technologies, depending upon where you are in the country, it's not a uniform platform. What can be recycled here cannot necessarily be recycled there. So part of this is a technology discussion, which is what we are involved in. Part of this is talking to your state representatives, your local representatives to try to increase more recycling so that you can, in fact, recycle more and have more post-consumer recycling into packaging.
Yeah, great points. Thank you so much, Jeff. One last question for you. I thought this was really insightful. Eric Smith is asking, what are some examples of triggers to compost? Can you speak to that?
So yeah, the two common triggers there's three ways to, as I understand it, and there may be some composting companies that can add to this. But one method is it starts to slowly compost the moment it's made, and it's just a slow process. So what this means is that how long you can store the bag before use, how quickly it has to be turned over, what its storage conditions are, because it's just From the moment it's made, it's just a gradual composting. So you use the product quick enough so you get it before it composts too much. The other two primary triggers, one is heat. And if you get it warm enough, like in an industrial composter, it'll start to break down. If you don't hit that temperature trigger, it doesn't really start to break down. The thing that you need to be aware of, this goes back again to storage, because packaging very often is not stored in environmentally controlled buildings. So if heat is your trigger, then you better make sure where you're storing it isn't going above that heat trigger, or your packaging is going to start to degrade in your warehouse before you've even had a chance to use it. And the third most common one is moisture. It's exposed to moisture and it begins to break down. That's a bit problematic in the fresh fruit and vegetable industry, because we have a lot of moisture not only coming out of the fruits and vegetables, but in where the product is being used in the retailer and the food service. So again, it gets back to how much moisture, prolonged, how does that moisture start to trigger? And sometimes it's moisture and heat. So understanding the trigger, understanding your supply chain, making sure that you're able to use the package within the limits of its compostability. That makes sense?
Very well said, sir. Thank you so much, Jeff. Really appreciate that. It's something we all need to consider when we're looking at the correct packaging for our products, is the whole supply chain and how it's going to be used, how it's going to be sourced and how it's going to be used, and then how it's going to be recycled or composted or reused. So much to consider. Thanks again, Jeff.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Now we've got Dr. Jason Grant. He is the W.G. Wysor Professor of Agriculture and Director of the Center for Agricultural Trade at Virginia Tech. He has built an internationally recognized program in agriculture markets and trade at Virginia Tech, which includes planning and developing the annual Governor's Conference on Agricultural Trade through a partnership with 4 other state agencies across the Commonwealth of Virginia. He's also the co-author of recent Farm Foundation issue report, Assessing the Market and Trade Impacts of Canada's Proposed Plastics Packaging Restrictions. We look forward to hearing from you, Jason.
Great. Thank you, Cory. Thanks for that kind introduction. Thank you. I wanted to thank Farm Foundation for the invitation to this webinar event to provide some remarks on the potential, and I want to underscore potential, economic implications of proposals to phase out plastic packaging in fresh produce. And along the way, I want to take a look at, Cory, you mentioned it's important to understand where it's sourced from, and I want to take a look at that supply chain and hopefully give you a glimpse, or at least re-emphasize some of the importance of the North American market. So it's an honor to be here. As Cory mentioned, I'm a professor of agricultural economics at Virginia Tech. I also direct the Center for Agricultural Trade there. I also want to acknowledge my co-author, Dr. Nikolai Legrand, who is a research assistant professor with us at the center. And so I want to talk today about assessing the impacts of Canada's proposed or their pre-proposal on packaging regulations and some implications for North American fresh produce trade. So the findings here are those of myself, the authors and co-authors, and do not represent any other institutions or affiliations with this work. So next slide, please. All right, as we heard from Tamara and Jeff, plastic packaging is a ubiquitous feature of fresh fruit and vegetable trade, and that'll be sort of the focus of my talk here. It ensures product quality, product safety, integrity, as well as affordability and convenience for consumers. And I am an economist, so I don't know the science behind all of the packaging material that ensures all these great features. But I do like to talk about what, if we do have some shocks to the market, what that might look like for consumers. For highly perishable products, package design minimizes pathogens, contaminants, spoilage, all the things we might associate with food safety. They're also important for rural communities that can't get to the grocery store or the retail shelves, twice a week or 3 times a week, or they're only stopping there once. And sometimes they have accessibility challenges, and that's important for when we think about fresh produce. According to Value Chain Management International study, Canada's proposed regulations could increase food loss and waste, as Tamara sort of noted the importance of that. And approximately 64%, I think I got that number correct, of the total volume across 20 produce categories were sold in single-use plastics, and that's up from 60% based on the survey results in 2019. So in 2023, in August, and I think there was a great comment by Jacqueline in the chat, Environment and Climate Change Canada did publish a pollution prevention, a noble sustainability type of effort, planning notice for consultations to reduce the environmental impact of plastic packaging as part of a larger agenda. The proposed regulations as set forth in those consultations has the goal, environmental goals of requiring the large Canadian grocery retailers, defined, I think, with sales over 4 billion, that 75% of fresh fruits and vegetables could be sold in bulk or plastic-free packaging by 2026 and increasing to 95% by 2028. And so environmental regulations, while noble and well-intentioned and sustainable, exploring sustainable options, I just wanted to take a look at the North American market, because sometimes if they're not matched with the industry technology that underlies that, can be a double-edged sword for cross-border movements. And that's particularly true for the US, Canada, and Mexico, or NAFTA, as we, or USMCA now, as we like to refer to that integrated North American market. So there are significant cross-border movements that are optimized for different climate zones, growing seasons, regional comparative advantages, if you will. So in this Farm Foundation's report, we asked some what-if questions to evaluate the economic implications of plastic packaging regulations, or phasing them out. And we wanted to focus on what would that look like for retail prices, and what would that look like for per capita fresh fruit and vegetable availability for the average consumer. And we did that under alternative import supply reductions. And as you know, Canada is a country that spans, temperate and sometimes subarctic conditions. And so some of those growing optimalities that I spoke in climate zones are not as amenable to growing certain types of fresh produce. Next slide, please. So before I take a look at some of the economic impacts, I wanted to at least review where we're at in fresh produce trade. So let me begin by illustrating the importance to the US horticultural producers and distributors, the importance of the Canadian market. So in 2022, the US was the largest global exporter of tree nuts, the 4th largest exporter of fresh vegetables, and the 6th largest exporter of fresh fruit. This stacked bar graph illustrates the importance of the Canadian market for US exports. We just selected a few here: strawberries, grapes, a combined category called other berries, lettuce, and cauliflower and broccoli. So plotted here are US export values in millions of dollars to Canada, and then an aggregate region, which we call rest of the world, or ROW. At the top of the graph, I illustrated some shares. Okay, so these are the share of US exports in each product category that is exported to Canada. So for US strawberry, other berries, lettuce, cauliflower, and broccoli, you can see that US exports to Canada are, the share of US exports sent to Canada is 70 to 92%. For fresh grapes, the US exports are more diversified, particularly to Mexico and Southeast Asia, and about 1/3 are sent to Canada. On average, about 42% we find of US fresh fruit and 81% of fresh vegetables are exported to Canada. So this highly integrated market, it's regionally focused North American supply chain. It is one of the most dynamic food systems globally. It feeds a wealthy population. This population has a robust set of safe and nutritious food choices throughout the year. Next slide, please. Here's a look at a closer look at the importance of Canada's imports and the significant role of the US as an export supplier. So on the left, and I apologize if this is a little small, but the left figure focuses on imports of fresh fruits into Canada, and the right panel depicts imports of fresh vegetables. All countries except for the US and Mexico, which, given their importance here in the North American market, the remaining countries are aggregated into 6 regions. You can see that: Africa, Middle East, Asia, Europe, and Latin America. And then the line graph plots the share of Canadian imports that come from the US in each sector. So Canada imports 5.2 billion. That was in 2022. That was a record of fresh fruits, and about 3 billion of fresh vegetables in total from the world market. This import growth is really stark if you compare it to 10 or 20 years ago. Fresh fruit imports are up over 5-fold, and vegetables are up over 3-fold. Notably, the US, which is shaded in the red stacked bar, plays a critical role. You can see that while it has diminished slightly over time, and there's some growing shares from Mexico and Latin America, it remains significant. 43% of Canadian fresh fruit and 60% of Canadian fresh vegetable imports come from the US. Next slide, please. So the results in the previous figure give you the trade picture, but what I want to do here is capture a picture of how important is imports as a source of total availability of fresh fruits and vegetables in Canada. So for example, I noted that 87% of US exports of blueberries are exported to Canada. This doesn't guarantee that Canada has a high reliance on fresh blueberry imports from the US to satisfy total consumption in Canada. This is because Canada actually is a significant domestic producer, domestic production of blueberries. So here we present that picture, a graphical summary of the share of Canada's imports of fresh fruit and vegetables in total availability, total demand in the Canadian market. Here, that is equal to domestic production, subtract imports and waste, where reliable data can exist. We have 15 fresh fruits and 17 fresh vegetable products. And you can see the average share there on the right. Okay, so with the exception of blueberries and apples, imports of fresh fruits into Canada make up over 50% of total domestic availability for consumers. So that means that about 13 out of 15 fresh fruit products, or 87% of the products we evaluated, imports make up more than 50% of total domestic availability. And the average across all products that we considered is around 76% for fruit. The figure on the right in green is Canada's imports of 17 fresh vegetable products, or the share of those vegetable imports in total domestic availability, which includes domestic production. For 12 out of 17 fresh vegetables, the share of imports in total availability ranges from 54 and 56% for, say, onions and cabbage, to 96% for cauliflower. So for about 8, or roughly half of the vegetable categories presented here, Canada's imports to satisfy total availability or domestic demand is more than 75% for cauliflower, spinach, sweet potatoes, lettuce, asparagus, celery, peppers, and other vegetables. Next slide, please. And so finally, we wanted to ask that what if, what are, just to get a sense of what sort of price movements might we expect if we modeled an import supply reduction. And that is to say that, well, let's assume if the regulations to phase out plastic packaging were implemented today, and the industry wasn't quite there in terms of being able to meet that, or maybe the transition to bulk sale has other implications, but maybe that's not quite ready for distribution of all these products. So we wanted to at least capture that. What does it look quantitatively on retail prices and per capita availability? And so we looked at 3 scenarios: a low impact, about a 25% reduction to imports into Canada, a moderate impact, a 50% reduction, and then a high impact scenario, which was consistent with the VCMI study, I believe, at around 62% of fresh produce is sold in some type of plastic packaging. So that's a high impact scenario. Overall, I'll just speak to that. We find retail prices of the fruit sector in general are projected to increase by about 42% on average, and about 20%, 19 to 20% for fresh vegetables under a moderate, that middle scenario, middle of the road scenario. To put this into a broader perspective, we also looked at household expenditure data from Statistics Canada in 2021 when we completed the study. Earlier this year, and that was the latest year for which data were available. In 2021, the average Canadian household spent about $1,030, or a little more than $1,000 on fresh fruits and preparations, and about $967 on fresh vegetables. So what do our results mean? Well, it means that if we did, under a moderate scenario, phase out this plastic packaging, it could represent an annual burden to consumers, or quote unquote tax, if you wish, of about $616 US dollars, or about 800 Canadian dollars per household per year. 70% of that is on the fresh fruit side, and about 30% of that is from fresh vegetables. Under the higher impact scenario, the numbers go up. It approaches about 1,000 Canadian dollars per household per year under that scenario. Of course, much of this will depend on the ability, and remember, we only shocked import supply, right? So we left the domestic industry untouched. So much of this will depend on the ability of packagers, distributors, wholesalers, retailers to stock a larger share of fresh produce in bulk, and whether they can come up with a more recyclable material, and the willingness of consumers to pay higher prices for produce that may be sensitive, as Jeff noted, to crushing or bruises or blemishes in transport. So, Cory, that's all I have for a sort of economic look or economic context on plastic packaging proposals and regulations for fresh produce in a highly integrated North American market.
Thank you, sir. Very, very insightful, Jason. Really appreciate that. I think you've really hit the nail on the head here, that what we do in packaging will affect us all. And it's going to affect us all in the pocketbook. It's going to affect us all in what's available to us to eat. Mm-hmm. You mentioned different areas that maybe don't have fresh produce available. And if we aren't able to ship packaging in longer form, sustainability alternatives, we may eliminate some packaging, some fresh fruit for those people. It's very understandable. But then, like you mentioned, the biggest issue here, I think, is the cost delta. This impact on families who are already struggling, it could be massive. And so it feels
struggling
like,
with inflation too.
Yeah, it feels like our job in this world of sustainable packaging is to help the government find solutions that will get food to people that's fresh and it's as sustainable as possible, while not raising the costs so dramatically that people can't afford it.
Right. That's right.
Well,
and thinking too, Cory, we didn't necessarily connect any of our results to a health and nutrition module, which, fresh fruits and vegetables play a significant role in that sort of health and well-being of average consumers as well. Yeah,
that very important. Yeah, we need to feed people. The farmers work very hard to grow the crops that people deserve to eat as fresh as possible. I got a couple questions here. One is, I think, one that maybe only you could answer is, what would you say is the average expected retail price change for vegetables in general? You mentioned some very specific details. Do you have an average?
Yeah, under the moderate scenario, it was around 20%, 21% increase in prices for vegetables. And this because if you look across the vegetable space, Canada has significant domestic production in some vegetable categories. Fruits, it's a little less, but a little less production, I mean. But yeah, vegetables was a little more moderate. It's a little higher. I can't remember the exact number under the high impact scenario, but under the moderate or medium impact scenario, it was around 20%. just over 20%.
That's huge. And do you have any recommendations for us as sustainable packaging companies to focus on? Love to know your wisdom there.
I mean, that's a great question. I think finding solutions, at least from what I hear, you all are working very hard to find sustainable solutions that does this without impacting affordability and accessibility for consumers. And I mentioned particularly perhaps low-income consumers that need these vitamin and essential nutrients that come from a sector such as fresh fruits and vegetables. Continue to come up with. I never underestimate the industry sitting in our sort of academic chairs, Cory. I've watched the industry adapt to what we could consider as 5 years of turbulence and instability in global markets, right? And just the industry is powerful. So I never underestimate the industry to adapt. But let's make sure regulations are consistent with where the industry is at. And that would minimize the impact on everyday consumers in North America and in Europe, in Australia, in New Zealand, and everywhere else they're being considered. So I think it's great. I think the conversations, from what I can tell from a very distant outsider, the conversations with Canada, with Europe and others are continuing, and hopefully that matching process of where the technology is at and where the regulations come into play is for sustainability is so they're matched, they're married, and they're working synchronously.
Yes, I agree. Well said. We are working really hard at Orora Packaging Solutions and many companies across the globe to make solutions that will be more sustainable, reusable, higher post-consumer recycled content, mono materials. It's you would be amazed what's happening in labs around the world to make packaging more sustainable. So we're working hard on it, I promise.
Yeah, the whole food science dimension, it's fascinating for an economist, right? I mean, it's really cool to hear just the technology that goes into this. So thank you.
Well said. Well, thank you, Dr. Jason Grant. Really appreciate your wisdom, sir. And we'll move on now to our final speaker, Mr. Kevin Kelly. He has been the Chief Executive Officer of Emerald Packaging, Inc. since 2002. During that period, the company has quadrupled in size through diversification and innovation, becoming one of the largest flexible packaging companies west of the Rockies. He also founded ePack, which manufactures digitally printed packaging. He sits on the board of the Western Plastics Association and the Flexible Packaging Association. He has helped write legislation in California regarding the use of the term biodegradable in packaging, resin pellet containment, and store take-back programs. Thank you for joining us, Kevin.
And now I've joined you.
Welcome, sir.
Thank you. So my name's Kevin Kelly, and as Cory said, I'm the CEO of Emerald Packaging. I recently found out, actually, I've been the CEO since 1999, which tells you how memory can play tricks on you. But we've been working in the area of sustainable packaging, deep sci, almost since I became CEO. We were one of the first companies to introduce corn-based plastics into the produce section. And as Cory said, lots of work on legislation, including SB 54, which is the recycling legislation in California, working with the Western Growers Association, who achieved a couple of things on 54, field pack packaging being exempted from the regulations and the fees that are going to come from attempts to reinvent the recycling. But processed is not exempt. WGA has done a lot of work. It's been fun to work with them. And why don't we begin the slides? There we go, flexible packaging today. Flexible packaging, so I make the, for anybody who doesn't know, Emerald Packaging makes, for instance, the packaging that's used to package baby carrots. And to Jeff's point, it's just not a package. We put 8 to 20 holes, 100 micron holes in the plastic so that the carrots can continue to breathe and CO2 gets out of the package, and the shelf life gets extended from mere days to weeks, which is important when you're shipping product around the world. When you're shipping from Bakersfield to Ottawa or Newfoundland, extending that shelf life is incredibly important. The same with salads. Again, these small laser perforations creating breathable structures where they might not otherwise be. So the packaging we're doing in many ways I would define as sustainable because it's sustaining the product itself. We wouldn't have, frankly, we wouldn't have salads or baby carrots or, any processed fruit and vegetables without packaging. And it is one of the complications of this kind of supply chain and using this kind of technology to extend shelf life is the unintended consequence of litter and plastic going into the landfills, plastic going into the ocean. All these issues arise because of the choices we made, I suppose, as consumers along the way, that we wanted baby carrots, and the only way to get them is to get them packaged. So the issue of Canada really, to a large degree, is the issue of getting from Yuma to the border. Is once you cut a head of lettuce, again, going back to Jeff's point, you need the package to sustain it so it can actually get to Canada. One of my largest customers said that they would lose about 20% of what they ship into Canada to spoilage. Now, this person didn't think it was so bad because they'd be able to charge higher prices. So going to Jason's point, it's interesting how all these presentations end up going together. So we have a system, we have to figure out how to work with it. And I think the industry has been trying with varying degrees of success to do so. Next slide. So there have been one of the flexible packaging in particular, but plastic packaging in general, because of the fact that it's so lightweight, makes it difficult to recycle in current recycling systems. And while the technology exists to be able to recycle at the level of the recycling center, is very expensive and would require massive investment. Then you, of course, have the problem of actually getting the packaging to the recycler, because, again, it's so lightweight. You would have to probably stuff it all in the bag and put it into a curbside recycle bin once a month or twice a month in order to get recycling rates up, because in flexibles, I think the recycling rate is somewhere around 2%. The only programs really in North America, in the United States, for recycling are the store take-back programs, which frankly, are a non-starter, because I doubt the local supermarket wants to be a solid waste dump. So I think we have to come up with recycling technologies and recycling systems and recycling programs that actually recycle plastics. And right now, we're a ways away from that. All the legislation that's going in requiring the recycling of plastic has very close-in dates, 2028, 2030, and really tight definitions. I think California is going to expect something like 65% of plastic to be recycled by 2028. Well, the technology exists. To actually pull off such a thing would be like going to the moon. It's going to require massive investment, massive coordination, and getting waste haulers to pick it up at your curb, to actually getting the systems in place to be able to recycle, to creating end markets for all this recycled product. So recycling, I think, is the way forward. I think particularly mechanical recycling versus chemical recycling. I think the chemical recycling, which is where you basically take plastic and turn it back into a polymer by way of breaking it down very often into oil or natural gas, and then repelletizing it. Unfortunately, the early evidence on chemical recycling is that the greenhouse gas emitted in chemical recycling is about the same as the greenhouse gas emitted in making plastic pellets in the first place. So if what we're trying to do in part is reduce waste and reduce greenhouse gas, it's clear that mechanical recycling is going to be the way to go, and it requires a lot of investment. So next slide. Economic barriers. I think Jason summarized those fairly well in terms of outcomes. I think that broadly speaking, a lot of the solutions have existed in the sustainable packaging world for many years. Post-consumer recycled, that has what's called an FDA no objection letter, which basically means it can be used as primary food packaging, has been available for a very long time. It's starting to get produced on a mass scale. There's private equity and venture capital going in to build these facilities that can create the post-consumer recycled resin. It's just as the same issue goes with compostable, the issue is who's going to pay for this? Who's going to absorb the cost? Because the retailers and the grocers have made it explicitly clear, as have some CPGs, that they will not take any cost increase for a more sustainable package. They want sustainable packaging for free. This has a number of problems. First of all, it isn't free. Someone has to absorb the cost, and ideally, the cost would be spread out across the chain, with us absorbing it. In this case, the growers absorbing some of it, and of course, the retailers absorbing some of it and passing along what they can. In terms of a head of lettuce, to use 30% recycled resin would increase its cost, the final cost of the head of lettuce, around 2 cents. 2 cents. And evidently 2 cents is too much, because the retailers have so far made it very clear they don't want to absorb that, or they don't want to pass it on to customers, even though they're passing on a lot of other price increases to customers. It would seem to me that at some point, this conversation really needs to be had. It needs to be had now, frankly, about this question of wanting stuff for free when it comes to sustainable packaging. It doesn't really matter. Nothing in this conversation matters around sustainable packaging unless we figure out the cost question. Who's going to pay? And I'm going to bang on that more and more in terms of my talks, because the failure of retailers to pass along price increases goes all the way back to the post-consumer resin itself. If they can't, if there's no market for it because nobody's willing to absorb the cost, then you're not going to have post-consumer recycled resin. The technology is there, it's sitting there. In order for the investment to be there on a mass scale and produce enough so that we can hit the billions and billions of pounds of targets that companies like Walmart have committed to by 2025, 20% PCR by 2025. That's got to be the biggest joke at this point ever, because it's 2024 and no one's actually close to these targets, not Walmart, not anybody. And you're starting to see retailers come back and say, okay, we're not going to get to 25% recycled by 2025. We're going to get to it by 2030. You know, this is why retail regulators don't believe the industry when it says we're working on these things, because they don't get rolled out. And if I were a regulator, listen, I'm a packaging manufacturer, and you're hearing an edge of frustration in my voice, because it is frustrating to have these alternatives available and to have no one taking you up on them because they can't get them for free. So what is going to happen is far worse than what might happen otherwise, which is governments are stepping in with regulation. They're stepping in with bans, and they're stepping in with extended producer responsibility programs. Extended producer responsibility means exactly that. The producer is going to have responsibility for the waste they produce by their products getting thrown out into the landfill. It's important to note that in EPR systems, the producer isn't the manufacturer typically. Frankly, we're too small to be able to afford to help. We will help, obviously, in the process, because we're part of these regulations. But it's really the growers, the grower, packer, shipper, who is going to ultimately now bear the cost of creating recycling systems that can handle the waste from the products they sell in the market. EPR, the fees are going to be significant. This is mainly an issue in the United States right now, because EPR has existed in Canada for a generation. They've been recycling plastic in Canada for well over 10 years. Take back depots as opposed to take back to store. You're starting to see curbside programs get rolled out in Canada. Canada is so far ahead of the United States when it comes to packaging, recycling, packaging regulation, that it's a bit of a disappointment, frankly, that we would be looking at a produce packaging ban, when really what's needed is to build upon the existing system that Canada has, promote regulation, promote recycling, and get this stuff into post-consumer stream and get it at least one step circular with using post-consumer recycled resin and packaging. uh, you know, we really do have to face the economic question to go back to. There's two economic questions, or several. Jason's set of economic questions. What happens if you ban produce packaging? And my question, which is, okay, we're not going to ban it. Who's going to pay for all this stuff? And the producers are going to pay. Either they're going to take a cost increase in their current product, or they're going to bear the fees of reducing waste and getting this stuff out of landfill. So we're facing a brave new future in California. It comes in 2028. The producer responsibility organizations have been formed. The discussions about fees are happening. Most people don't know these are going on, but there's going to be a radically new system in California come 2028. Same in New York, Oregon, Washington. States are putting these systems in place because they no longer want to bear the cost of the waste. Shame on us for not doing things earlier. Well, a lot of us have been working and trying to for many years. I'm not saying that companies like Diorigo, Grimway, Taylor have been at the forefront of this. Driving it into the market is the difficult thing. So kudos to the work the produce industry has done, but there's going to be more. And I'm sure they wish as much as I did that we've been able to get more of this stuff into the market faster. So it is an honor, as Jeff says, to work in this industry because we are packaging a live product. And I think regulators have to be conscious of this, consumers do, but it still comes with some responsibility. And I think that's where we've been struggling. And the answers are being given now at the government level. And so we better be talking to the regulators and finding a path forward. And I think that's it.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Really well said. Appreciate your wisdom as always. And I agree. We're all going to have to absorb these cost changes. It's interesting when people put their foot down and say, we're not going to absorb any cost changes. Well, there will be cost changes, most likely.
Yeah.
And so those will need to be absorbed by the producer, and then those will be passed on to the consumer, unless there's some kind of government kickbacks that are possible. That you never know, but it's going to affect us all. And I really appreciate what you said there. I did have a couple questions from the audience here I'd like to get to. Eric Smith says, what are some examples of suggestions that you have, Kevin, to take advantage of the available yet unused technology, and how can those be shared?
Well, let's just take a post-consumer resin. Now, post-consumer resin doesn't work in every product. For instance, with salads, the mix of the materials is such you lose some control over the OTR. But in field pack, it works just fine. The package in that case is really there for protection. There's some shelf life extension involved because there's larger perforations in the package, but it's much more of a one-to-one relationship. So I think that bringing it in to the field pack sector first makes a lot of sense. Now comes the difficult question of cost. I think we've been pretty much an open book about where the cost increases of our product is. So it's somewhere between 3 to 5% for 30% post-consumer recycled resin. In some cases, I've made it very clear we're passing it on for free because we need to get the stuff into the market. We, in fact, have been putting 5% post-consumer in all of our packaging now for about a year to test its viability in the production process, in our production process, and it works quite well. I think, maybe we don't pass the whole 3 to 5 on, and maybe we pass 1.5% on or 2%, and then something gets passed on to the retailer and so on. We're talking on the order of fractions of a percent in the total cost of the final product. This isn't, rocket science. That isn't significant, really, when you consider where inflation's been going over the last year. I think compostables, it's a much more difficult to sell, where you're looking at packaging that is 10 times the cost of the current packaging being used. Then it is a real economic hit. I think compostables have their place, but I think post-consumer is the way to go right now, and it's available. And we just have to find some way to sit down and have an intelligent conversation. The funny thing is, we've done these polls through the packer about how much of a cost increase you would take for a more sustainable package. And grower packers usually say 10%. And then you get to the table and it's 0. And, sometimes it's because you're working with the purchasing department who's charged, with that, not taking increases, finding ways to decrease cost. What we're trying to do in the case of post-consumer is to offset some of the cost, is to eliminate zippers or down gauge, make the plastic thinner in order to bring the cost hit to neutral or even less. In Romaine Heart packaging, for instance, we're finding that consumers don't seem to care that whether there's a zipper there or not, and principally probably because the zipper has never particularly worked that well, to be honest. I think there's ways to do this that make it economically viable, and even in the process of having the conversation about 25 or 30% post-consumer in a package, we redesign the package and actually bring the cost of the package down. Right. So there's a lot of things possible if we start talking about this, as opposed to shutting down the conversation out the gate because we think the end product is going to be too costly. It's not, and there's ways to offset it.
Yeah, well said. I want to speak to your experience at EPAC for a little bit. Why is digitally printed pouches more sustainable and sometimes less costly?
Well, as I think because we're only, say, printing 1,000 pouches, digital is for very, very short run work. So for smaller product introductions or product promotions in a single market, or sometimes just marketing things like people sending in their pictures and having them printed on the package. Digital is artwork to press to end product. There's no printing plates or anything involved. So that's the production process itself is more sustainable in that sense. You're not producing that waste. And because you're able to print 1,000, order 1,000 packages, print 1,000 packages, as opposed to what happens on a printing press, the printing presses I have, which are massive, you're finding yourself overrunning or underrunning fairly significantly sometimes. We don't have to do that so much in digital because of the speeds, and the waste in the process is much less, and so forth and so on. Also, compostable packaging as a percent of a short run is much less. So compostable packaging is much more economically viable in a digitally printed job than in a conventionally printed job. So with digital, you have the elimination of waste, you have the elimination of overruns, and you have the ability to use more exotic films because the film as a percentage of the cost is much lower, even if it's compostable. Right. So the economics are there, and it is a great technology. The company has gone from our company's gone from 2014 $0 in sales to over 100 million today. So there's a big demand out there for it. It's a worldwide company, and if you haven't checked it out, check it out.
That's excellent. Great points. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Kevin. And thank you to all the panelists today. We're going to now open it up to the whole group for questions. So if you're listening or watching, put a question into the Q&A portal there, and we'll get it answered here as if we can get to all of them. We've got about 15-20 minutes available for this. So yeah, thank you again. This is an interesting question. I don't know if anyone here has experience in this domain, but I wanted to ask this question and just throw it out there. It's understandable why eliminating plastic packaging for fresh produce is complicated and sometimes unsustainable, but what about bottled water and other non-perishable beverages? Have there been any successful or promising forms of packaging for those types of products?
Well, I can take a quick stab at it. I think
Yeah.
if you look at the bottled water industry, what people are looking at most is reusable, reusable containers as opposed to buying the plastic bottled water. I'm not aware of any, I have seen in certain kind of outdoor outfitters where they're coming up with non-plastic alternatives, but they're pretty much a niche kind of thing. So at least based on my experience, the bottled water is, as Tamara mentioned earlier, that's the reusable one. That's where people are really trying to focus on reusability. The other thing that's interesting with bottled water, if I can just do a quick side thing here.
Yeah, please.
When we talk about plastics in the ocean, we need to talk about what is the likelihood of something getting into the ocean. So if you look at fresh cut or fresh salads and bags and trays, those are pretty much used at a consumer level and disposed of or recycled or composted at the consumer's home. So the chances, at least in North America, of it getting into a waste stream that gets into the ocean is much less, whereas a bottled water can become litter. And litter has a much higher likelihood of getting into creeks, streams, rivers, and ultimately the ocean. So when you're looking at the life cycle of plastics, it's important to look at where is the plastic going to be disposed of, and therefore what is the likelihood that it could get into the ocean. Now, that's not to say that, fresh produce or food packaging will never, but the likelihood is much, much less than, say, a bottled water, which could become litter.
Yeah, great point.
And I just piggyback, I think the ocean debris issue, Jeff, really isn't it more microplastics?
It's both.
Us washing our clothes or driving our cars, and
I mean, a lot of microplastics comes from clothing, from tires, from cosmetics. And there's actually been some studies that you can look up on that. But, ocean plastics are both macro and micro. And then you can also, start looking at fishing, the fishing industry and whatnot, and how plastics are getting in the ocean. So there's a number of different sources, but when you're doing your life cycle analysis on your packaging, which I didn't get a chance to talk about, that you really need to do as you're looking at alternatives, you do this life cycle analysis, and one aspect of that is to determine where the plastic gets disposed of and how that's then related to potential ocean plastics.
Yeah, great points.
I don't know if that answered your question, Cory, but
Well, it certainly helped. And I think there's a lot of what ifs and maybes in this industry, and we need to discuss them all fully and look at all the options and opportunities.
I think bottles actually have some lessons because you pay the deposit fee, for instance,
Yeah.
and you get it back if you recycle it. That's promoted. Bottled water is the most recycled plastic out there, and I think it is partly because of the fee. So if there's some fee placed on the amount of plastic you're using at the checkout stand, that encourages you to come back and recycle it or recycle it in some way, that would help. Again, a price signal. This is capitalism, you know. So I think the bottled segment has a lot of lessons for us, and we really ought to be looking at that when it comes to produce packaging, when it comes to all flexible packaging and clamshell packaging.
Very true. The states that have enacted a deposit return scheme have recycling rates of more than double the states that don't. And so it's working. And I'd like to see a national program for that someday, international even, to your point, Kevin. I think it's worked, and we need to enact it on possibly on more kinds of packaging as a possible solution. Dr. Grant, I have a question here. I think that maybe relates to what you were talking about, but it's open to all of you, because you spoke to Canada specifically. But here's the question: can you comment on how the stringent packaging requirements, e.g., recycled content requirements, recyclability requirements of the PPWR for the European Union will impact exports of U.S. agriculture products to the EU?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. We haven't looked specifically at the EU, but the the single market there has, spans a little bit more of a climatic zone than say Canada and the North American market. So it's a great question. We haven't looked into it. We have a number of issues. Both Canada and the US have a number of issues for agricultural exports to the EU in many sectors. So, but this particular question we haven't addressed. My sense, and this is just my intuition and understanding the supply-demand fundamentals, is that the retail price impacts to consumers would be a bit less than they would be in Canada. And again, this is not saying that this is the policy that's going forward, because it's not. But if these types of restrictions are phased in, we feel for the average consumer that it would be a little bit less in the EU because of the way that it can be sourced within the whole common market there. You've got melons and all kinds of sort of subtropical stuff that can be produced in Spain and southern parts of Italy and things like that can be brought through that market. A little less dependent on the US in most sectors, except they love our tree nuts and things like that. But yeah, that would be my initial guess. It's a great question. Haven't looked into it yet, but thanks for that question.
Yeah, thank you. Anybody else want to speak to the EU and how that could affect them? I do want to, yeah, please,
I
Tamara.
could add some thoughts in terms of what happens if the regulations go forward. So one of the targets of the regulation is single-use plastic, right? And so there's a vision in those regulations for a lot of produce to go in bulk. And I think that vision for some people might seem doable or desirable, but the reality is that if we want to keep food waste and the quality of the product, and definitely food safety, selling fresh produce, some produce items in bulk, is nearly impossible if we take those food safety and quality into consideration. It's interesting enough that other food products are not even fathomed to be sold in bulk. no one is asking to sell all sodas in fountains at their grocery store in Europe.
Right.
And I would argue that not only, so that's not happening, or all milk to be sold in fountains at the grocery store. And I will argue that of all food products, fruits and vegetables are the most essential for human health. And they're the primary products that we need to consume. And they're the ones that need to be safeguarded as much as possible so they get to the consumer. So that's food for thought there in terms of, are we willing to do fountains for everything? Because that is what selling produce in bulk means.
There have been bans in Europe that have been reversed at the country level because of the food waste has skyrocketed. I think this happened in France
Right.
in 2023. Perfect example of what happens, the unintended consequence of good intentions. Selling everything in bulk might seem the way to go, but again, we get back to this food waste question. And in the United States and Canada, we shop a lot differently than they do in Europe.
Very true.
Yeah, I mean, I go to the store once a week, and I don't have time to drive the 20 minutes to Whole Foods 3 or 4 times a week. Yeah, so there, and of course, imagine the greenhouse gas, the unintended consequence there from me driving around. But I think Europe has already provided us some cautionary tales when it comes to banning produce packaging, and hopefully regulators are looking at those consequences.
Yeah, well said. I'd like to ask each of you for a final thought. So start thinking about something that you'd like to leave the audience with, that may be an actionable thing that they can work on with their company or with their personal life, or whatever you think that can help make them more sustainable in this world. But I totally agree with you, Kevin. We've learned a lot from Europe, and that's very true, that they've rolled back some things and made some really significant progress in other areas like reusables and in Germany and things like that. It's impressive to see, and it shows that it's possible in many ways. But yeah, so let's start with Tamara. Would you give us all a kind of a final thought, something that you'd like everybody to take away from this?
I'd like to end with what I started with. Fruits and vegetables are essential for our health, and because eating more fruits and vegetables, we are becoming a solution to climate change. There. No more, it's not more complicated than that. And then the third part is that fruits and vegetables come with packaging, and that we're working very strongly for that packaging to be more sustainable every day, but we need support in that sustainability journey.
Well said. Thank you so much. Jeff, to you, sir.
Again, like Tamara, I'm going to kind of just reiterate something, maybe say it in a slightly different way. Food packaging, especially fruits and vegetables, but food packaging in general, is a much more complex technology than the casual observer understands. And as you're looking to sustainable options, even to what Kevin said, for a field pack, post-consumer recycle works real well. For a fresh cut salad or fresh cut fruits and vegetables where you need to have a strict oxygen transmission rate, not so much. So, not to sound too much like a broken record, but really understanding the functionality. And although the package may just look like a clamshell or a bag or whatever, a pouch, there's a lot more to it than people realize. And if you're going to replace it, you need to understand it.
Very, very true. Well said. Dr. Grant.
Yeah. And Jeff, I was one of those casual observers. As an economist, boy, when we spoke to and the food science department at Virginia Tech is just down the street from our agricultural economics department. And it was really eye-opening. The technology, the design, the optimization that goes into this was just really steep learning curve when we started on this trade work. Cory, I think I'm just going to build off Tamara's point about, and it's not just North America, and it's not just Europe.
Right.
You have over 90% of the population live in developing countries, where Canada, the US, Europe, Australia, New Zealand feed a growing population there. And they are going to depend on nutrition. They're going to depend on that product arriving in a suitable form for consumption. And so think about those implications. When their economies grow, their purchasing power increases, right? And that reverberates back, that feedback loop comes back to Canada, it comes back to the US, it comes back to Europe for additional sales and growing, growing productivity and growing advances in our industries. So think about that as well. We've actually captured some of the nutritional profile of US and Canadian exports right now in another separate study, and it's really eye-opening when you start mapping the micronutrients and macronutrients embodied in some of that distribution in trade coming out of North America. It's really cool to see, and where that ends up in the developing world. It's a neat little study. So anyways, think about those implications to piggyback on to what Tamara said.
It's fascinating. Thank you, sir. Kevin, final thoughts.
I'm going to swerve off in a completely different direction, I think, which is that I would really like to see more produce companies involved talking to regulators and legislators, because when these conversations do happen, I think both sides come away with a greater awareness of, for instance, with produce packaging, the regulators, I think, come away with a greater awareness of why it's important. But they have to hear. I think it's much more effective to have them hear from the grower shipper than from the packaging supplier. Because I sound self-serving, and I am, but to a degree here, obviously. I have an economic interest in this whole conversation, but so do the produce companies, and they have a lot of weight in California and in Washington, D.C., and in Ottawa. And I think particularly a good example of this is the work that CPMA has done on the Canadian regulations. They have an expert in the office there in packaging, and he's in conversation with the regulators, but he's also brought in a lot of grower shippers to talk to the regulators, and worked with the grocers. And so first, support your trade association, because they're really important to this conversation. Second, get involved in the conversation. Put yourself out there. It's rewarding work. I've gotten to know some really interesting people, and I've gotten to know the legislative process a lot better. And you see how the sausage is made, and it's made in conversation. It's made in getting Jason's data in front of people. It's made in getting Jeff's message in front of people. And I really do think that having, not just dismissing the conversation or being frustrated and walking away from it, I think engaging in it is really important. It's economically important, and it's also important in getting the solution right. Bans don't make sense here. Something else is needed, and that's a conversation that needs to involve a lot of folks, not just regulators or legislators. It has to involve us, but we have to be willing to get involved.
Yeah, well said. Give your time, give your wisdom. On this panel, I couldn't even add up the years of experience here. You're all brilliant people, and I think there's hundreds of, if not thousands, of other people in the industry like us that can add value to local governments, larger governments, national and international committees to help make packaging more sustainable. My advice to producers would be reach out to great packaging companies like Orora Packaging that can help redesign and implement more sustainable options for you. And check out my podcast, Sustainable Packaging. It's really insightful. We just launched our 300th episode. So there's lots to learn about sustainable packaging and lots to know about it. I really appreciate all of you, and thank you to the Farm Foundation and for giving us this platform. And thanks for your time for listening. I'll transition it now to Martha King.
Thank you, Cory, and thank you to all of our speakers for your insightful discussion today. I'd also like to thank all of you in the audience for joining us and submitting your questions and staying engaged in the chat. We appreciate that engagement, and we'd love to hear your feedback. So please take a moment to share your comments about today's session in the brief survey you will see at the conclusion of this forum. If you would like to help us continue providing valuable programming such as today's forum, I'll quickly remind you about becoming a friend of Farm Foundation. Check the link provided in the chat to learn more. Each and every gift to Farm Foundation strengthens our abilities to address rapidly evolving issues impacting agriculture, the food system, and rural communities, and we are so grateful for your support. Also, please be sure to save the date for our next Farm Foundation Forum on May 14th, Global Agricultural Trade and Sustainability, Gaps and Opportunities. You will see a registration link on the survey email we'll be sending to you shortly. Thank you once again for joining us today. We will now conclude the forum.